So thank you very much for the contributions so far, and a lot of very important and interesting issues have been raised. So our fourth speaker today, I'd like to welcome Elaine Pearson, is the Australia Director and founder of Human Rights Watch based in Sydney. She works to influence Australia's foreign and domestic policies to give them a human rights dimension. Prior to joining Human Rights Watch, she worked for the United Nations and various NGOs in Bangkok, Hong Kong and London. She's widely published and holds advisory roles in many areas of human rights. Welcome, Elaine.
Thanks so much, Sue. I'd like to start by acknowledging I'm on the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Thanks so much for giving Human Rights Watch an opportunity to say a few words today and be a part of this really important discussion. 30 years ago, in October 1991, Cambodia's warring factions, including the Khmer Rouge, and 18 countries, including Australia, signed the Paris Peace Agreements. Yet 30 years later, as we all know, the country faces a grim reality of repression and abuse. And since 2017, the only genuine opposition party has been banned, politicians, human rights activists, even Facebook critics are in prison, and independent media, which was one of the early successes of Paris, has been wiped out. We've seen hundreds of political killings over the last 3 decades that have gone unpunished, and far from a liberal democracy, Cambodia is actually, just as it was before Paris, a one-party state led exactly by the same person in power, Prime Minister Hun Sen. So I think on this anniversary, 30 years is actually not the most important number. It's 36 years that Hun Sen has been in power, and it's 42 years since the CPP has been in power, installed by Vietnam in 1979, almost as old as me. So there are at least 80 political prisoners that we know of in Cambodia right now, and that number is expected to increase the closer we move towards the elections in 2022 and 2023. Among those prisoners are youth activists, political opposition, journalists, and people who've criticized the government, including people who've criticized the COVID-19 response and the vaccine rollout on Cambodia's most popular social media platform, Facebook. The charges imposed against these individuals vary from incitement to conspiracy. Some are in prolonged pretrial detention, others have been convicted in unfair trials. And among them are more than 24 human rights defenders in prison. This includes a concerning number of environmental activists. Attacks against environmental activists have increased, especially since the start of the pandemic. The authorities often accuse activists of trying to use foreign funding to topple the government and incite social chaos, when in fact they are documenting the government's destruction of the environment and natural resources. And there are numerous cases filed against those affiliated with the environmental group, Mother Nature. Most recently, another disturbing case before Cambodia's courts is the case of a 16-year-old boy with autism, who is the son of a former opposition member who is currently in jail. Now, this boy has been detained since June. He's accused of incitement and public insult. At trial, his defense lawyer twice requested that the boy's disability and support needs be evaluated. However, the court has refused both of those requests, and he remains in detention. The COVID-19 pandemic has also been a very convenient pretext for the government to expand its authoritarian rule by restricting civil and political rights and failing to protect the social and economic rights of marginalised groups. The government has adopted a new overly broad COVID-19 law, which allows for up to 20-year prison sentences for those who violate COVID-19 measures. We're also seeing increased online surveillance and new laws passed to monitor all internet activities, which will come into force early next year. And in 2021, we also saw how the authorities used the pandemic to further stifle press freedom by labelling independent reporting as fake news and imposing de facto bans on independent media. So I think, these are some of the current problems that Human Rights Watch is working on and documenting, but we're really here today to talk about what can be done to stop the rollback on human rights in Cambodia, and especially what people here in Australia who are concerned about the human rights situation can do, and how we can encourage the Australian government to take further action to protect the rights of Cambodians. So firstly, and this has already been alluded to by Gareth and Julian, they've talked a bit about the need for targeted sanctions. It's really important that Australia adopts a targeted sanctions law so that those who commit serious human rights abuses and acts of corruption are not free to travel to Australia or to hide their wealth or assets here. Now, while the government has committed to amending the autonomous sanctions regime, progress towards this is extremely slow, and what the government proposes is quite limited. In fact, in the government's response to the parliamentary inquiry recommending a targeted sanctions law, the government said, well, we're only going to tinker with the existing autonomous sanctions regime, and we're only going to look at the violation of 3 rights: right to life, right to be free from slavery and forced labor, and the right to be free from torture and cruel and degrading treatment. Now, from our point of view, there are plenty of activities that should be sanctioned that are not included, and this is much narrower than the laws that we see in other countries. And so, we're seeing that Australia is already falling behind other like-minded countries by not having a proper targeted sanctions regime. The US, Canada, the UK, the EU, they all have targeted sanctions laws. And as others have said, will only be effective if we can work in unison with other like-minded governments. Second, there's already been a bit of discussion about, UN action. What we really need are strong UN resolutions on Cambodia that reflect the reality on the ground. And the most recent resolution that was adopted this month at the Human Rights Council by consensus is weak, and it does not accurately reflect the human rights deterioration in Cambodia. I think earlier there was a question about whether a commission of inquiry would be a way to go. My personal view is, look, we have a special rapporteur, we have this resolution that happens every 2 years. It's really important that we keep that, but that we ensure that it is strengthened. We know that the UN special rapporteur has another mandate for 2 years. And we have also seen that there will be another oral update by the special rapporteur in March next year at the Human Rights Council, which is ahead of the election period. So now's a really important time to ensure that the special rapporteur is armed with the facts so that the special rapporteur's update reflects the reality on the ground. It was also really disappointing to see during the negotiations for that resolution, only a handful of states from the Western group pushed for stronger language. And this was really the US, the UK, the EU, and Canada. Australia was not part of that group. Meanwhile, Cambodia and its allies, China, Venezuela, Cuba, Russia, Belarus, and the Philippines, they were arguing for more congratulatory language on Cambodia's achievements and less international scrutiny. So what we ended up with was this sort of compromise resolution, which, frankly, does not reflect the reality of the situation on the ground. Thirdly, there's also been a bit of talk about foreign interference, and I think it is really important that acts of foreign interference are reported to the Department of Home Affairs in Australia so that they can act. And this obviously includes any acts of harassment, surveillance, threats, or intimidation by foreign agents here in Australia, or also threats that are made to family members back home as a result of activities in Australia. Now, we know that this occurs, but it is also important that complaints are registered so that the government can, be encouraged to take further action. Fourthly, it's important that the Australian government speaks out more often in joint statements with like-minded governments on human rights abuses. Now, this is in addition to private representations on human rights. So, for instance, it would be great to see more joint statements to react to trials of political prisoners and condemning politically motivated prosecutions. And that includes the ongoing politically motivated prosecution of, former Australian MP Hong Lim. Public statements matter, so it's not enough for there to be, these private representations. They matter for accountability, for transparency, and for solidarity. And they show the Cambodian people what the Australian government thinks and cares about, especially when the Cambodian government is now exerting such control over the media. And we know that the Cambodian government has a long practice of seeking to manipulate bilateral meetings into expressions of support for the government. You'll remember the photo of champagne with dictators, which went viral. So it's really important, actually, that at every bilateral engagement that Australia has with the Cambodian government, whether that is on trade, security, or development, that this is an opportunity to raise human rights concerns and especially raise the profile of specific cases of concerns, cases of political prisoners. Fifth, we think that Australia should also look at stronger regulations in place for overseas supply chains of Australian companies that are trading in Cambodia. This doesn't just apply to the labour sector, but also to land disputes. Australia does have a Modern Slavery Act, but this is quite weak in terms of its enforcement powers. So a supply chain law or a regulation could be helpful in also holding private actors to account for their rights abuses abroad. And we're seeing right now in the EU is actually drafting supply chain legislation, and Germany has recently adopted such measures. Finally, given concerns about ongoing abuses by security forces and the lack of accountability for security forces that commit acts such as killing and torture, joint actions with the police and military should be limited, and there really needs to be very strict vetting for anyone who is travelling to Australia from Cambodia to ensure that they haven't been implicated in human rights violations. Again, this is an area where Australia really needs a specific legal provision like the US that would require the government to vet all foreign security personnel. So in the US, this is referred to as the Leahy Law. In Australia, we hear from the government that such vetting takes place, but it's on an ad hoc basis and there is no legal requirement for such vetting, which means that if the government determines that they have other reasons why it's important to bring someone over for training, human rights considerations may simply be sidelined or ignored. I think I'll leave it there because, we'd love to leave enough time for discussion at the end.
Thank you, Elaine, very much indeed. There were some excellent issues that you brought forward. That it's extremely interesting in terms of what can be done to try and protect the influx of political prisoners, the laws that Hun Sen is enacting that really are striking down. The Internet Gateway law, I know, is going to be exceptionally difficult for people to combat. But I'll move along because just so we can keep the time a bit. And I'd like now to introduce our next speaker, Serena Lillywhite. Serena Lillywhite is the Chief Executive Officer at Transparency International Australia, an international organisation tasked with tackling bribery, corruption and money laundering. TI also has an office in Cambodia. Serena has had a 25-year career in responsible business conduct and is an experienced corporate accountability practitioner, researcher and advocate. Serena has worked on the social dimensions of international business, particularly governance, corruption and human rights in many sectors. She is widely published with several corporate accountability publications. So welcome, Serena.
Thank you very much, Sue, and Jimrit Sua. I'm joining you from Wurundjeri land in Melbourne, Australia, as you know, and the land of the Kulin Nations. And I wish to pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to thank you very much for the invitation to speak at this event, and my thanks to the organisers, and also to the brilliant presentations of all the speakers who've come before me. A number of the issues of which I was going to raise, they've touched on, so I'll keep it short and go straight to some of the suggestions. Mm-hmm. And in thinking about preparing for this presentation, I was reminded that the last time I spoke at a commemoration of this important event was actually at the 25th anniversary when I was living and working in Phnom Penh, and ironically it was a very important public holiday on that particular occasion. Mm-hmm. I'm just going to focus on a couple of issues, particularly around corruption, money laundering, and what can be done in Australia in terms of legislative reform to tackle some of these issues, but also the role of the private sector. As of course many of you know, and we've heard, Cambodia is one of the most corruption-prone countries in the world. It scores just 21 out of 100 on the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, one of the most widely used indices of corruption. And in our region, it's only Afghanistan and North Korea that score lower than Cambodia across the Asia-Pacific region. And I think what's really emerging from what's been said this morning and the expertise on this panel is a recognition and indeed the need to recognise even more that corruption and human rights violations and environmental degradation go hand in hand. And of course, corruption is not a faceless crime, and it's most often, you know, the most marginalised, particularly women and Indigenous peoples, who are disproportionately impacted by corruption. And as we've heard just now from Elaine, we're seeing an even greater uptick, if that's at all possible, in the level of attacks and targeted attacks against environmental and particularly human rights and particularly environmental defenders, you know, not least being Mother Nature most recently. So moving straight into, I guess, what some of the actions and possible solutions could be, you know, noting that this is a really hard and tricky issue that we're all considering this morning. I think we are all in fierce agreement that internationally all 19 countries who signed the agreement must not stay silent. And indeed, they have a responsibility to revisit and reacquaint themselves with the terms and conditions of the Paris Peace Agreement and put pressure on the Cambodian government to return to a path of democracy and ensure, of course, free and peaceful elections. And as we've also heard, you know, Australia doesn't have a great deal of sway, let's kind of call it out, but nonetheless there are those soft diplomacy approaches that need to be pursued, all of which should be done, in my view, with the intention of providing support to the people of Cambodia, to civil society organisations, journalists and businesses in Cambodia, so that they actually feel supported to peacefully advocating for the government to foster political reconciliation and hold those free and fair elections, and basically to build democratic governance. I think the point that we've sort of has emerged this morning too is just how important it is in any democracy, including Australia, to have a strong voice, a strong and vibrant civil society movement, so that civil society is able to hold power to account. And clearly that's not the case in Cambodia at the moment, and indeed that space for civil society is rapidly shrinking, and aided and abetted with the introduction of some very draconian laws which have the intended purpose of effectively shutting down NGO voices. So moving to a couple of points I wanted to pick up on. So noting that you know, as Julian said, Australia has limited influence in Cambodia. What can the Australian government do? And I really want to focus on this issue of money laundering. Australia has become the go-to destination for money laundering. In fact, our doors are wide open to dirty money, much of which is coming from Cambodia, either flowing directly into Australia or via transit or secondary countries. And one of the reasons why so much dirty money that is often the proceeds of crime and corruption, is ending up in the Australian property market, as Borong indicated, is that Australia's anti-money laundering laws are very, very weak. The law does not require real estate agents, accountants or lawyers to do any due diligence as to the source of that money, to ask questions as to whether or not that money may be the proceeds of crime or corruption, and the real estate agents, the accountants and lawyers are not required to report suspicious financial transactions to the financial regulator in Australia. So that means that effectively you can pay cash for property in Australia with no questions asked as to the source of that money. And we know that Often properties are being bought, particularly in Melbourne and also in the Gold Coast, which are now often owned by the sons and daughters of the ruling elite, or indeed owned through effectively shell companies or sham companies that really are linked to the ruling elite in Cambodia. And so one of the really critical things that the Australian government can do is actually meet its international commitments, which are now 16 years overdue, to strengthen our anti-money laundering laws and comply with the recommendations of the Financial Action Task Force, which again goes to Julian's point around how we need a coordinated approach, not only in the region, but indeed with all those 40 countries that have signed on to the Financial Action Task Force principles. So the point is that with so much dirty money flowing into Australia and ending up in the property market, and much of it coming from Cambodia, the Australian agencies need to be doing much more to follow the money, to follow the trail of that dirty money, and to see exactly where it's coming from, whether or not it's connected to politically exposed persons and the ruling elite, and indeed what countries it may be transiting in or travelling through before it gets to Australia, as an intended way of actually hiding the source. And of course, you know, if there is better tracking of this dirty money, then that then allows some of the issues that have been raised before about, you know, the identification of dirty assets, seizing of those assets, the introduction of sanctions and so on. And of course, when assets are seized, then it needs to go further than that. There needs to then be compensation for those who have been impacted. So let's say, for example, there's been a land grab in Cambodia, which results in approvals being given for a mine to be opened up that may be linked to an Australian company. For those landowners, those communities who have been evicted from their land, they should be adequately compensated. The other thing Australia needs to do, which will help the people of Cambodia, is to introduce a public register of beneficial ownership. And we need to fix our corporate register laws, because the reality is it's just far too easy for anybody to register a company in Australia without any checks done as to who is the ultimate beneficiary, who even, who really owns the company. And this can be done through the use of nominee directors. So, for example, someone from the ruling elite in Australia might want to establish a company in Australia that's not really a company, it's actually just a vehicle to launder dirty money. And instead of them doing that in their own name, which might be a little bit obvious, they will appoint a nominee director. And in Australia, there is no requirement for nominee directors to disclose who they're acting on behalf of. So again, we need to fix our corporate register laws, and we must introduce a public register of beneficial ownership, so we know who's really controlling and pulling the strings. The final point I wanted to make is related to the issue of what role can multinationals that operate in Cambodia play. And this, of course, includes Australian companies and indeed Australian companies who are involved in not just operating in a high corruption prone country such as Cambodia, but they're also conducting business in corruption prone sectors such as mining and infrastructure and construction. And so these companies that are operating in Australia, they also have a responsibility to uphold the principles of business and human rights as outlined in international standards such as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises. But what does this mean in a practical sense? Well, companies, and let's say Australian companies that want to do business in Cambodia, they need to make it very clear that they will not pay bribes to secure approvals and permits and licenses for example, for a mining project to be approved. And they will not tolerate or turn a blind eye to violence, harassment and imprisonment of human rights and environmental defenders. And companies, Australian companies, need to also make clear that they want to uphold the principles of meaningful community consultation and consent, including the principles of free, prior and informed consent, to address those issues such as land grabs that we've talked about. So if Australian companies want to operate and do business in Cambodia, they need to champion business integrity and they need to champion the respect for human rights. And they need to be asking questions, particularly on if they're involved in agribusiness, mining or infrastructure. They need to be asking questions as to whether or not land grabs have been involved in that particular project. And that also flows through then to the role of the investor community. What role should Australian banks, financial institutions, superannuation funds, what are their responsibilities in terms of doing the sort of due diligence they should be doing to ask the right questions around links to crime and corruption, possible targeted attacks on human rights offenders. And of course, there has been the one high-profile case involving the role of the ANZ Bank in the so-called blood sugar case. And so there is a significant role for the investor community. And I agree with Elaine that by and large, much greater due diligence needs to be done by the Australian government and by companies operating in Australia. Elaine touched on the issue of supply chains, certainly not just in the garment sector, as she mentioned, but also to be thinking about what Australia needs to be doing, such as a number of other countries have done, where we're seeing increasingly countries introducing the requirement for mandatory business and human rights due diligence laws to be introduced. And that's something that is a long way off in Australia. So I might leave it at that, so there's time for questions too.
Thank you very much indeed, Serena. There were some fascinating thoughts, and that really gives us a good framework to go forward and discuss the issues that Australia should be addressing to approve its own oversight and look at the way in which we do manage the corruption that's pouring into Australia from Cambodia too. So thank you very much indeed. And I'll now move to our final speaker, and we'll just move along as we're getting very close to time. So that is our next speaker is Mark Butler, who was elected as the Labor Member of Parliament for Port Adelaide and Hindmarsh in the Australian Parliament in 2007, and is the Shadow Minister for Health and Ageing. Mark served as Minister for Ageing and Australia's first Minister for Mental Health in the last Labor government. He has also held several other ministries and was elected as National President of the Australian Labor Party in 2015 and is now currently the Senior Vice President. So welcome, Mark.